Hi, everyone. Welcome to this afternoon's program. My name is Rabbi Alyssa Mendelson. I'm the rabbi at Port Jewish Center here in Port Washington, and we're thrilled to welcome you to this afternoon's program with author Jonathan Kaufman. Let me tell you a little bit about him. He's a Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter who has written and reported on China for 30 years for the Boston Globe, where he covered the 1989 massacre on Tiananmen Square, the Wall Street Journal, where he served as China bureau chief from 2002 to 2005, and Bloomberg News. He's the author of A Hole in the Heart of the World, Being Jewish in Eastern Europe, and Broken Alliance and the Turbulent Times Between Blacks and Jews in America. He's a winner of the National Jewish Book Award, and he's also the director of the School of Journalism at Northeastern University in Boston. Most recently, he has written The Last Kings of Shanghai, the rival Jewish dynasties that helped create modern China. And today, Professor Kaufman is here to talk to us about that book. And I know there's a lot of excitement on our community's part. We're really looking forward to hearing from you today, Professor. And so without further ado, I turn things over to you.
Oh, thanks very much. And thank you all for zooming in on this very nice, almost summer-like day. I was saying to the rabbi earlier that this is really a treat for me because I sometimes feel like I'm living under a old Yiddish curse, which is may your book come out during a pandemic when all the bookstores are closed. So it's nice as we emerge from things that I get to talk with you a little bit about the book and some of the people I met and the families that I write about. People often ask me, how did I get interested in this topic? Because Jews, Shanghai, it doesn't quite seem like it would be a natural topic. My interest actually began back in the late 1970s. I was right out of college. I was just starting out as a foreign correspondent. And I went to China, I went to Shanghai, and I was walking along the Bund in Shanghai. Now, China back then was very different than it is now. It was still Red China. Mao had just died a few years earlier. Everybody was wearing those blue Mao suits that we remember. There were far more bicycles than cars. It really was, it felt like the time had stopped there in the 1940s. It was like a black and white movie. And so I was in Shanghai doing some reporting, and I was walking along the Bund, that beautiful street along the waterfront with the Art Deco buildings, and I had to use the bathroom. And so I stopped into this hotel, and when I walked through the doors, it was like walking into a movie set from 1935. There were these beautiful marble floors, crystal chandeliers, etched stained glass windows, and a bellhop came up to me all dressed in white with a little white cap. And when I asked him in English, where was the men's room, he responded to me in French. And so I left there thinking, what was this place? It was such an anachronism in the middle of communist China to find this throwback to the 1930s. And someone told me that this hotel had been built by Victor Sassoon, who was a playboy billionaire who had lived in Shanghai in the 1930s. He was Jewish and had once been one of the wealthiest men in the world and the wealthiest man in Shanghai before World War II. So the way reporters do, I kind of filed that away. A few years later, I was back and someone said to me, oh, there's a good feature story you should do. You should go to the Children's Palace in Shanghai. And the Children's Palace was where people in Shanghai would take their children for music lessons or ballet lessons on the weekend. So I thought that would be kind of a fun story. So I made my way there. And again, it was sort of a sight out of Great Britain more than China. It was a beautiful big English mansion, almost like a country house, set in the middle of Shanghai with beautiful lawns. And then when I went inside, there were children taking their music lessons and so forth, but there was also just incredible elegance everywhere. The ballroom was about the size of a football field with these beautiful chandeliers, fireplaces at either end. There were sweeping staircases that led up to the bedrooms. And it was clear that a very rich family had once lived there. And as I left, there was a little plaque by the entryway that said this had once been the home to the Kadoorie family. Well, I knew the name Kadoorie because they were a very wealthy Jewish family in Hong Kong, where I was living at the time. And in fact, they were one of the most powerful families in Hong Kong. But I didn't know that they had once spent decades in Shanghai building up their fortune. And then when I went to China as a foreign correspondent, where I was basically there for 3 or 4 years with my family, we would travel around, and we were there with our 3 kids. And the kids always loved going to Shanghai. They thought it was exotic and different. And we were exploring the city at one point. And as we were walking around down some alleyways and kind of a poor neighborhood, I noticed that on the doorposts of many of the tenements, there were shadows of mezuzahs, not mezuzahs themselves, but the shadows where they had once been put up there. And again, I was thinking, what were Jewish mezuzahs doing in the middle of Shanghai? And of course, these turned out to be the homes, the tenement homes, where thousands of Jewish refugees who were fleeing Nazism from Berlin, from Vienna, other cities in Europe, had found refuge, and it had been saved and had stayed there during the war. They were staying there in Shanghai. So as reporters sometimes do, I sort of gathered all these facts, but it then occurred to me that I wanted to find out more. I wanted to find out who were these families, what was the history, what had happened here. And the story really started for me, and the history really starts in Baghdad. Most of us know the story of Fiddler on the Roof, of the Jews who grow up in shtetls or in ghettos in Russia or Europe, succeed and then move up through society. But the Jews in Baghdad were different. Baghdad is actually Babylon. And in the Bible, where we read the story about the Jews who were taken from Jerusalem after the destruction of the temple, and they were kidnapped really, and brought to Babylon. And in the Bible, we read that by the rivers of Babylon, they wept when they remembered Zion. Well, these Jews wept by the rivers of Babylon, perhaps, but they also did incredibly well while they were there. The Jews in Babylon, which is now Baghdad, became quite wealthy. They became very involved in trade. And in fact, they became so prominent that the rulers of Baghdad often relied on them for economic help, for help raising taxes, for building trade routes and expanding their own power. And they named one family, one Jewish family, was named as what was called the Prince of the Captivity. And this family was meeting regularly with the various Turkish or Ottoman rulers of Baghdad. And this family was the Sassoon family, one of the families that I write about. And the Sassoons were so prominent that whenever they would go to meet with a pasha of Baghdad, they would be carried through the streets in a sedan chair. And everybody, Jew or Gentile alike, would bow their heads respectfully when the Sassoons would go to the royal palace to consult with the rulers. Now, as often happens in Jewish history, at a certain point, politics turned against the Jews. And in the early 1800s, many wealthy Jews started being kidnapped and held for ransom by the government that was trying to extort money from them. And David Sassoon, who was 37 years old, was about to take over both his family's commercial empire, but also to assume this lofty role as the Prince of the Captivity, an advisor to the royal family, was instead seized by the police and thrown into jail. His father ran down to the jail, ransomed him out, but realized that his son was not going to be safe if he remained in Baghdad. And so he took him down to the waterfront and put him on a ship that he had rented. And before the ship set sail, David Sassoon's father gave him a cloak. And inside the cloak, it had been sewn with pearls and precious gems. And he wrapped that around his son's shoulders. And then he set sail, leaving Baghdad forever. So I think of this story not as Fiddler on the Roof, but almost Shakespearean, which is a prince, an almost royal person who basically spends the rest of his life, and his family spends much of their lives, trying to reclaim the position and the wealth that they had once had in Baghdad. David Sassoon ended up spending his first night out of Baghdad, sleeping on a warehouse floor as he made his way to India, with a gun by his side to shoot the rats that were skittering back and forth. But he made his way to Bombay in India and arrived there just as the British were arriving to turn India into a colony. And David Sassoon saw a huge business opportunity presented by the British. The British were conquering territory everywhere throughout the world, and they were relying on merchants, Jewish merchants, immigrants, and others to help plant the Union Jack everywhere. And so David Sassoon used a lot of the business skills he had learned when he was being groomed to take over the family dynasty, and very quickly became one of the richest men in Bombay. He was able to bring out his family from Baghdad, and they settled in Bombay. And David Sassoon also decided that the future really was with Great Britain. Britain was a huge empire. It would eventually conquer, almost a quarter of the world's territory. And David Sassoon was determined that he and his family would be part of that. He himself never learned English, but he made sure that all of his 8 sons learned English. They learned British history. And in fact, when Queen Victoria was named queen, he stood on the waterfront in Bombay and loyally sang "God Save the Queen" with his sons. Several of his sons stopped using their Arabic names and began using British names like Albert and Edward, and they really became part of British society. Now, at this time, Britain was really trying to open up trade with China, and they were driven by the sale of opium. Opium was incredibly profitable. David Sassoon had begun dabbling in the opium trade, but it was very hard to do if you were still kind of a small businessman. But the British decided to go to war with China in the 1830s and 1840s. They defeated China in what's known as the Opium Wars. And as a result, China was forced to open up many of its ports and the city of Shanghai to Western traders and British traders. And this was the moment that David Sassoon seized upon to really turn his business into a global empire. He had 8 sons, as I mentioned, and he basically deployed these 8 sons all across China. He sent them off and told them to open up outposts in Shanghai and Hong Kong, up and down the coast of China, and to start trading with the Chinese, sending things to India and then on to England. Now, just imagine what it was like. I mean, these were, the sons were quite young. They were still teenagers or in the early 20s. They arrived in China. They didn't speak a word of Chinese. They were isolated. Most of them had left their families back in Bombay. But they all turned out to be brilliant businessmen who saw the opportunities in China. I sometimes think of China in the 1850s, 1860s, like Silicon Valley, where young men, and they were almost always men, could go and really make a fortune quite quickly. And one of the things the Sassoons did was that they ended up being incredibly innovative. To get the opium from India to China, people typically used sailing ships, which took several weeks. But the Sassoons began investing in steamships that could travel that route just within a few days and enable them to get their products to China much faster. They invested in this new technology called the telegraph, which allowed them to communicate with each other and with their father back in India. And so by the 1870s, they were so successful that they had essentially driven all their British rivals out of the opium business and taken it over completely. And in fact, when I was able to read the old business records of the various families that were involved in the opium trade, some of the British rivals are kind of writing, who are these hook-nosed Jews? Who are these Jew boys who are taking away our business in China and making so much money? So even though there was great business success, there was always this kind of anti-Semitism that lurked beneath the surface. But to be clear, this was opium that they were dealing with. The Chinese believed that opium was destroying their society. About 12% of Chinese were addicted to opium at this time. It was really a scourge of most cities and of many families in China. But because the British had won the war, they were able to trade in it. Opium was legal. It was taxed by the British in India. And in fact, even in Europe, you could buy various compounds of opium because aspirin wasn't widely used at the time. And so when you talk to the Sassoons today, their attitude is, well, you know, it's like cigarettes or it's like alcohol. It was a vice, but it was legal. And for us, it was a business decision. But the truth is that the Sassoons knew how dangerous opium was. They themselves never used it. They often had to fire Chinese who worked for them because they were addicted to opium and they saw the damage that it did. And I think the moral questions this raises about decisions that the Sassoons made as businessmen are serious ones. I think certainly as Jews, we like to think that, you know, if you're Jewish, you're going to bring a certain set of moral values when you do business. But in this case, the Sassoons were very much like the other British businessmen of their time. And as the saying goes, every fortune is built on a great crime. And in the Sassoon case, the crime was opium. In 1949, when the communists conquered China and moved into Shanghai, they seized the Sassoon business records. And in those records, they determined that the Sassoons had made about $1 billion from selling opium. And that money was then used to buy property in Shanghai and factories and so forth. It was really the root of their fortune and made them one of the wealthiest families in the world. I want to talk a little bit about the women in these families because they're fascinating. And I think the role of women, especially when we're looking at history from the 19th century, the early 20th century, not enough attention is really paid to that. As I mentioned, David Sassoon had 8 sons. And after he sent them to China, he realized that to succeed globally, he also had to send them to London. And so he began sending his sons one by one to London. And urged them to buy country estates, to enroll their children in Eton and in other British boarding schools, to send their children to Oxford and to Cambridge. And the Sassoons became very successful in London. They became very close to the Prince of Wales. They supported his gambling habit. They would have these lavish parties where British aristocrats would come. And they were really buying their way into British society quite successfully. Although again, when I could read the diaries of these British aristocrats, they often would make fun of the Sassoons and make anti-Semitic comments. They were happy to take advantage of their hospitality and do business with them, but they didn't really like them because they still saw them as outsiders. One of the challenges this posed to the Sassoons was that all the boys, all the sons were in England living large, going to Buckingham Palace, having these elaborate parties, and there weren't many brothers left to watch the business in Shanghai and in India, where all the money was being made. And at one point, the youngest Sassoon son died in Bombay unexpectedly. And there was a big question about who was going to run the business because everyone else was in London. At this point, Flora Sassoon stepped forward. She had been married to the youngest brother. And she said that she would be happy to run the business as kind of a regent until their son, who was a teenager, came of age to take things over. And her brothers-in-law figured that was fine. You know, she wasn't going to be able to do very much. She was just a woman, and they figured she'd be a caretaker until her son became of age and the men could take over again. But it turned out that Flora was a brilliant businesswoman. She spoke many languages. She was very smart. And she began to run the company. But what was remarkable was this was at a time when not only women couldn't vote, women in India lived behind what was called purdah, which meant they couldn't even be seen in public. And so Flora Sassoon began running this huge business empire from her living room. But gradually, in a way that often scandalized people, she began to step forward. She began visiting the Sassoon offices, visiting factories across India, taking more and more of a visible role. And in fact, in a situation much like the one we're still living in, a plague broke out in Bombay, and the bubonic plague. And all the workers at her factories refused to come to work because they were terrified of getting sick. So Flora Sassoon went out. She commissioned scientists to come to Bombay to look for a vaccine that would stop the spread of the bubonic plague. And they discovered one. And then in another scandalous move, she decided to get vaccinated and have someone photograph her with her arm exposed, getting the vaccine shot, so her workers would know that the vaccine was safe. It turned out to be a very smart move. Her workers all came back to work. The dynasty was saved, and she was very successful. But all this began to make her brothers-in-law very nervous back in London. And they decided to stage a boardroom coup that ousted her from the business so they could take back control. And Flora Sassoon left Bombay. She sailed to London, where she herself became a very prominent scholar and philanthropist and hostess, but she never set foot in the Sassoon businesses again, even though she had saved them from ruin. A friend of mine said to me, it's like she hit the bamboo ceiling, and that I think was very true. Another remarkable woman is Laura Kadoorie. The other family I write about in this book is the Kadoorie family. They too came from Baghdad. They initially worked for the Sassoons, and Elie Kadoorie, who was the patriarch, arrived in China when he was just 18 years old, but quickly became a millionaire, decided to leave the Sassoons and go off on his own, and became quite wealthy. And as he turned 30, he figured it was time for him to find a wife. And so he sailed to London and met Laura, who was the daughter of a very prominent British Jewish family, and they got married. Now, typically what would have happened at that point is that Laura would have gotten pregnant, would have stayed in London, and Elie would have gone back to China, visiting a couple of times a year to see his children and his wife, but they would go their separate ways. But Laura announced that she was going to go with Elie to China. She was a very independent-spirited woman, very adventurous, and she was not going to be left behind. And so the two of them sailed to Hong Kong. She had 2 children in very quick succession, and then announced that she wasn't going to stay in Hong Kong either. She wanted to accompany Elie as he traveled around through China. And even more remarkably, for my purposes, she kept a diary during all those years. And it reads a little bit like, Katharine Hepburn and the African Queen. There was civil war in China. There was incredible poverty. These were very dangerous trips. And she is always there with her husband, the 2 children, a retinue of servants, as they're sort of discovering this new country. But one of the things that happened is that Laura in many ways became the conscience of the family. As she traveled through China with her husband, she saw the terrible poverty and basically concluded that the education of girls was going to be crucial if China was ever to modernize. And she began to push her husband to build schools for Chinese girls in China. Now, this was unheard of. This is around 1900, 1905, and no one was really thinking this way. But as a result of Laura's efforts, these schools were opened up in Hong Kong. She even built a school for Arab girls in Baghdad because she believed that education was the way in which China would be able to reclaim its independence and get out of this terrible poverty and endless war that it had fallen into. The family eventually settled in Shanghai, in a mansion in Shanghai. And one day a fire broke out, and Laura ran out of the fire onto the street. But she became convinced that the governess, the Chinese governess she had hired to take care of her 2 boys, was still inside, trapped in the flames. So she ran back inside the house to look for her. As it turned out, the Chinese governess had gotten out through a different door. Laura became disoriented by the smoke, and she was overcome by the smoke, and she died in the fire. Now, this was obviously a tragedy for the Kadoorie family, but it was also something the Chinese talked about and still talk about today. The idea that a British woman would rush back in to save the life of a Chinese servant was something they just found unimaginable. And I think it speaks both to Laura's character, but also to the way in which the sort of lessons that she left with her family and the way she was very much the conscience of the family really shaped them going forward and shaped the view of many Chinese towards Jews. I want to jump ahead now to probably the most fun part of the book, which is the story of Victor Sassoon. As I said, most of the Sassoons were living in London. They were spending their money, they were enjoying it. And Victor Sassoon was enjoying it more than most. He was a playboy. Even in college, he was always seen with a chorus girl on either arm. He was handsome, he was athletic, and everyone assumed he would be one of those Sassoons who would spend money but never make any. Even as a college student, he had one of the best wine cellars in all of England. But during World War I, he was a pilot, and his plane crashed, and he became crippled. He lost the use of his legs and had to get around on crutches and eventually a wheelchair. And he fell into a depression because he believed he'd never be able to have the great romantic life and adventures that he had been enjoying as a young man. And so he decided to leave Europe and to move to India and then Shanghai and take over the family business. Once again, this Sassoon, Victor Sassoon, turned out to be a brilliant businessman. He basically built that hotel where I found a bathroom all those years later. He began to build buildings all throughout Shanghai, beer factories, the tram system, was spending money at an astonishing rate. But even more so, he knew how to enjoy his money. Victor Sassoon really turned Shanghai into one of the most attractive destinations in the world. Right now, we're all planning our post-pandemic trips and where we're going to go. And if this were back in the 1930s, we'd all be going to Shanghai. Charlie Chaplin would go to Shanghai to meet with Victor Sassoon. He would sail over there on a luxury liner and stay at Victor Sassoon's hotel. Noel Coward went to Shanghai. He wrote Private Lies in a suite at Victor Sassoon's hotel. Wallace Simpson, who would later make the King of England leave his throne, was photographed in Shanghai nude, except she was wearing a life jacket. And that gives you a sense of what Shanghai was like. It was exotic, it was a little dangerous, but it was fun and it was glamorous. And it really became part of the world tour that so many wealthy celebrities and families began to take to see what Shanghai was like. And Victor Sassoon was at the center of all this. He would give these elaborate parties, costume parties at his hotel, where all the guests would have to dress up as circus acts, and he would dress up as the ringmaster. Everybody would have to dress up as if they were school children, and he would be the school principal. When I was doing the research for the book, I was in Shanghai, and I got a chance to visit the suite, the penthouse suite that Victor Sassoon built on top of his hotel. The windows overlooked his empire in Shanghai. It was very luxurious, and I was walking through it, and I went into the bathroom, and there were 2 bathtubs in the bathroom. And so I said to the Chinese fellow taking me around, I said, "Why are there 2 bathtubs here?" And he looked a little embarrassed, and he said, Victor Sassoon said he never minded sharing his bed, but he didn't like sharing his bath. So that was what it was like to be Victor Sassoon in Shanghai in the 1930s. He was a playboy, a very successful businessman, the wealthiest man in Shanghai. But starting in the late 1930s, different people begin arriving on these ocean liners from Europe. These are Jewish refugees. By the late 1930s, of course, the Nazis have taken over in Germany. They've invaded Austria. They're threatening all of Europe. And the Jews are desperate to get out. But as we know, every country in the world had shut their door to Jewish refugees by this point, including the United States. But Shanghai, because it was partially occupied by the British, in part by the Americans, in part by the Japanese, in part by the French, really didn't have a functioning government. And that meant you didn't need a visa to get in. And what that meant for the Jews is that if you were able to make your way to Shanghai one way or another, you could be safe. You could get refuge in Shanghai. So as word spread about this throughout Europe, thousands of Jews, most of them middle-class Jews, doctors, lawyers, musicians, professors, began to sell their belongings in Berlin and Vienna, made their way to Italy often to hop onto these cruise liners with their families to make it to Shanghai. Now, again, imagine what this was like. I mean, they leave Vienna, they leave Berlin, they arrive in Shanghai, which is hot, it's crowded. They don't speak a word of Chinese. Very few people in Shanghai speak any English, and they don't really know what to expect. And in a really extraordinary moment, both Victor Sassoon and Elie Kadoorie, the head of the Kadoorie family, step forward and begin to help these refugees. Victor Sassoon opens up many of his buildings to house them. Elie Kadoorie starts a school for the children where they can have some structure and learn English and history to try to have some kind of a normal life. But even more remarkably, Victor Sassoon begins what I consider a great con game with the Japanese. The Japanese had already invaded China. They were advancing on Shanghai. They hadn't conquered the city yet because they didn't want to go to war with the British or the Americans. This was right before Pearl Harbor. But they are very anti-Semitic, and they put a member of the Japanese Navy, Captain Inuzuka, in charge of what they call their Jewish problem, which were all these Jewish refugees, thousands of them who were showing up in Shanghai, trying to figure out what to do with them. The Nazis, of course, are telling them what to do. You should just kill them or shut the gates completely. But Victor Sassoon turns on the charm and invites these Japanese anti-Semitic military people to his hotel. And he says, come to my nightclub. You can drink, you can eat, you can really see what the good life in Shanghai is like. But secretly, he's spying on them, and he's reporting on their activities to the British. He is secretly supporting many of these Jewish refugees who are arriving penniless and giving them money and places to live. At one point, Victor Sassoon even flies to South America to try to buy land where these Jews can be resettled, he's hoping. But most importantly, he persuades the Japanese to keep the gates open so that Jews can keep on coming in. And he does this by telling the Japanese that, I'm very wealthy, I'm very well connected. Maybe I'll speak to Winston Churchill, who he had gone hunting with, to stay out of the war. I have a lot of friends in Hollywood. I'll get them to pressure President Roosevelt. He basically is doing everything he can to save as many Jews as they're coming in from Europe. The Japanese eventually figure out what Victor Sassoon is doing, and he has to flee Shanghai. The Kadoories don't get out in time. They're imprisoned by the Japanese right after Pearl Harbor. And at this point, there are 18,000 Jewish refugees who are in Shanghai who have found refuge there. And the Nazis then show up. They send members of the Gestapo, and they say to the Japanese, here's what you do. You should gather all these Jews up, put them on barges in the middle of the river, and then sink the barges. And that way you'll get rid of your Jewish problem. But in part because the Japanese have been persuaded by Victor Sassoon that having Jews there can sort of work to their benefit, that maybe influential Jews in other countries will kind of, make things easy on the Japanese, either after the war or when the war is starting, the Japanese refuse to turn against the Jews. And one of the miracles of World War II is that even though Shanghai was completely surrounded by the Japanese, was occupied by the Japanese were allies of the Germans. And even though the Nazis were urging the Japanese to move against the Jews, not a single one of these refugees was killed during World War II. They all survived. And it really is, almost a Schindler's List kind of situation for these refugees. Now, after the war, the Americans liberate Shanghai, and both Victor Sassoon and the Kadoories return to Shanghai thinking the good times will resume, the parties will resume, they'll keep on making lots of money. But of course, that doesn't happen. Instead, the communists take over, they seize Shanghai. Victor Sassoon flees. He flies out. He has a return ticket to Shanghai, but he never uses it. He ends up settling in the Bahamas. And most of his fortune is gone. Most of his money was in real estate. It was in the hotels, the factories, all the things he had built in Shanghai. And the communists, of course, take all that over. And he ends up being quite bitter about his time in China. The Kaduris, by contrast, had begun moving their money out of China even before the war, and they decide to go to Hong Kong. And over the next 30 or 40 years, they help rebuild Hong Kong into the kind of remarkable city that we see today. They become the wealthiest family in China. Today, the Kaduris are worth $13 billion. They have a lot of investments in China. They meet regularly with the president of China. They're very influential. And right now are kind of sitting in China, in Hong Kong, I think very nervous because they're seeing the crackdown that's taking place in Hong Kong and throughout China, and wondering if their time is again coming, as it once did in Shanghai, where they're going to have to flee. I think I'll stop there because I'm sure you have questions. But it is really a remarkable story about these two families that ended up standing astride Chinese business and politics and culture for 175 years and still are incredibly influential in China today.
Wow, that was amazing. Right? I'm seeing the faces, the few people who have their screens on her. So I want to give people an opportunity to ask questions. So you can let me know in the chat if you want to ask a question, or you can just raise your hand and I can call on you. So I guess I'll start with you, Joyce Lansman.
Hi there. I just wanted to share that my parents are from Baghdad, and I believe they knew the Kaduri family. And I had an aunt and an uncle that worked in Hong Kong for several years. So reading your book really enlightened me on the situation that I never knew of before, and I want to thank you.
Oh, well, thank you. I mean, the Kaduris were, I think, more private than the Sassoons. The Sassoons became very prominent in England. Siegfried Sassoon became a very well-known poet. My book just came out in England, and when you mention the Sassoons in England, it's like talking about the Rockefellers. I mean, people know who they are. But the Kaduris were always a little more private. And so I think getting their story out there, because in some ways it's a much more human story with Laura Kaduri dying and people in Japanese captivity. It's a much more painful story, but I think it's one that really deserved to be told.
Thank you.
Mark and Marcia, can I call on you to ask a question?
Yeah, I'm just wondering, with what happened with Shanghai, well, with China really, looking back on it, do you think there were any opportunities for the Sassoons and the Kaduris to, especially the Kaduris who seem more socially conscious, to get out in front of things and, maybe, with all the corruption there and everything, and maybe China's history would have been different?
That's a great question. It's interesting. As I mentioned, Elie Kaduri, the patriarch, died under Japanese captivity. The whole family was arrested. And Elie Kaduri was in his 70s and 80s, and he died. And that meant right after the war, the whole empire, the Kaduri empire, went to his sons, who were in their 40s at that point. And they, I think, looked back and they concluded that their father had made a mistake, exactly what you're saying. They had lived in this mansion, this marble hall, this children's palace that I visited, which was their mansion. It was 3 people in 43 rooms with 42 servants. And I think they said to me, they concluded that their father had been blind to all the inequality and hadn't realized what was going on, and therefore was surprised when the communists kind of were so successful. And so his 2 sons, Horace and Lawrence, decided that in Hong Kong, they were going to rebuild the fortune, which they did and then some, but that they wouldn't be so politically tone deaf. And so one of the things that I think also being imprisoned did to them was it gave them a bit of a refugee mentality in Hong Kong. And as a result, the Kaduris in Hong Kong begin helping Chinese refugees. So when the communists take over, hundreds of thousands of Chinese are fleeing China into Hong Kong. They're poor, they're desperate, and the Kaduris step in and begin to buy up land and to give to these Chinese refugees to have small farming plots, to grow vegetables so they can begin to kind of rebuild their lives in Hong Kong. The Kaduris also invest a lot of money in agricultural research to help these refugees and to improve pigs. Pork, as we know, is the main, a staple of the Chinese diet. And the Kaduris larger pigs with more meat that would be more profitable for the Chinese refugees, but also would allow people to eat better. And it was incredibly successful. The Kaduris probably helped about 300,000 Chinese refugees in Hong Kong. And the joke among the Chinese refugees, they used to say, the Kaduris know everything about pigs except what they taste like. Because they were keeping kosher. So that's a way in which I think the Kaduris recognized that they had made mistakes in China and were trying to do things differently in Hong Kong.
So we have a question. Hold on, let me just get it back from the chat box. How did these families maintain their Jewish identities? That's from Nancy Kaplan.
In very different ways. The Sassoons, I think, in many ways were seduced by Britain. They became knights. They were knighted. As I said, they were entertaining royalty and the aristocracy. Originally, David Sassoon, leaving Baghdad, was very religious. And initially, when the Sassoons went to London, I was able to see the wills that they filed. And the wills, you could hear the patriarchs, thundering, you must marry someone Jewish, you must marry someone Jewish from Baghdad. But over time, they began to intermarry. Some of them converted, and some of them, to blend into British society in that kind of assimilation, their Jewish identity became less and less important. The British never forgot that they were Jews. They talked about it all the time, but the Sassoons themselves, their Jewish identity, for most of them, became less important. A few went to Jerusalem and maintained a kind of strong religious feeling, but not so much in Great Britain. The Kaduris were different. It was interesting. The Kaduris very much wanted to become British, and Eli Kaduri tried over and over again to get British citizenship in the early 1900s, and he was always turned down. And in fact, I found a document in Hong Kong where the British were saying, we can't give Eli Kaduri citizenship because if we do, we'll have to give it to lots of them. Clearly they wanted to limit the number of Jews they were going to give citizenship to. Eventually, Eli Kaduri got citizenship because he realized that if you gave money to the British royal family's favorite charities, that was the best way to get citizenship and ultimately a knighthood. But so I think the Kaduris always felt more like outsiders. And as a result, they were strong Zionists. They supported the creation of the State of Israel. In fact, Eli Kaduri, when the Balfour Declaration was issued, went to Sun Yat-sen, who was the first president of China, and got Sun Yat-sen to endorse the Balfour Declaration. And Sun Yat-sen writes this remarkable letter to him where he says, your people have lost their homeland, my people are losing their homeland too, to all these imperialists. We have something in common with the Jewish people. It's really an extraordinary thing to say back then. And so the Kaduris, I would say today, are basically they're Reform Jews, sort of like Michael Bloomberg. They're very prominent for a lot of things, and their Jewish identity is important to them. And I think part of the reason for that is that they were never fully accepted by the British. And even with all their wealth, they always felt that they were a bit on the outside looking in. And I think that helped maintain their ties to Judaism.
So the next question is, actually, Bela, do you just want to make your comments? Just unmute yourself. You're still muted, Bay.
The wrong thing. Okay, sorry. So I just wanted to say that I really enjoyed every word of this book. It was so much fun to read. And I was once in China. Well, actually, I was in China twice, two different places. Once was in the Western provinces, so that wasn't relevant. But I was in Shanghai and Beijing. And so it was great for me to sort of envision those places through your eyes and through the eyes of the people in your book. But now I want to go back and explore all those places, because when I went, the focus on that tour was not,
Right.
Jewish history. So I'd love to go back and look at it now through those eyes. So thank you for that.
Thank you. Well, and you certainly can. I mean, it was interesting. I was doing a talk like this in Los Angeles, and someone said that they were doing business in Shanghai. And they were in a taxi, they had a translator, and they mentioned something about being Jewish. And the cab driver, the Chinese cab driver said, oh, we Chinese, we did a good job during World War II. We helped the Jewish people. This is like a cab driver. And so if you go to Shanghai now, there's a very good museum that commemorates the Shanghai Jewish story, the Jewish refugee story. And they've almost built a little kind of Shanghai Jewish Disneyland, where they've rebuilt some of the cafes that the Jews were set up and things like that. So I think there is a kind of increasing fascination among the Chinese with this history, and they're making it easier and easier to try to track it down.
Thank you.
Joanna Scherer, do you want to ask your question?
Okay, I have no problem asking it, but it's pretty easy. Did either of the families have branches in the United States? And why did they go to Britain and not the United States, which has more of a reputation for being open to Jews?
Well, I think it's interesting. I think part of the paradox of these families, and one of the things I had to grapple with, is they were imperialists, they were colonialists. When David Sassoon arrives in Bombay, we like to think, because we all know in Jewish history, Jews become socialists, or they're on the side of the oppressed, or they become communists, or they want to sort of help people. David Sassoon in India sees the British and thinks, I want to be an imperialist. I'm not going to fight for the rights of the poor Indians who are being colonized. I want to be on the side of the winners. And so Britain always had this attraction to both families, because in the 19th century, it was the world's biggest superpower. It was a global empire, and it was willing to sort of, while socially restrictive against Jews in terms of business and economics, was willing to kind of work with Jews and make them part of the empire. So they're very British. I mean, when you meet them today, I mean, the head of the Sassoon family is Lord Sassoon. He's a member of the House of Lords. The same with the Kaduris. They were made members of the House of Lords, and the current members are all knighted. And that's sort of how they see the world. They really see it through British eyes. The Kaduris are very wealthy. They own the Peninsula Hotel chain, so they've got a couple of houses. I think they've got it in California and elsewhere. But I think their outlook is still very much kind of those old British, they wouldn't be out of place in Downton Abbey. It's that kind of view of the world, I think, not the American entrepreneurial home of immigrants. The Kaduris and the Sassoons very much saw themselves as part of the ruling class.
Thank you.
Okay, so I see 3 questions, so we'll take just 3 more. Linda Berman, do you want to ask your question next?
Sure. Well, first, thank you for this wonderful presentation. We really enjoyed it. And also to let you know, we did stay at that Peace Hotel in 1989, so we know exactly what you're talking about, how it seemed so out of character to the rest of Shanghai at that time. We went back a couple of years ago, and of course, Shanghai has become very modern, and so now the Peace Hotel just kind of, I think they changed the name, but it just fits into the Shanghai landscape. But our question was more about, during that time, how did the Chinese population in Shanghai view the Kaduris, the Sassoons, as well as the Jewish refugees? Did they completely lead separate lives, or was it their intermingling?
No, it was really interesting. So in a way, I think the Sassoons and the Kaduris began to open up Shanghai and the Chinese in Shanghai to give them a view of what the West was like. They were very modern companies. They were very modern Westerners. Victor Sassoon, while he was a playboy, was also one of the first Westerners to invite Chinese to his parties and to come to his hotel. And in fact, when they were redoing the hotel, they put an ad in the company, the Chinese company that took it over, put an ad in the Shanghai newspapers in Chinese saying, if any of you have artifacts or memories of the Peace Hotel, we'd like to see them. They wanted to put together a little museum in the hotel. And all these Chinese families started showing up with like souvenir plates they'd gotten when they'd gone to the Peace Hotel for a family anniversary, or a menu, or a picture of them with Victor Sassoon. So the hotel really was a way that, you know, upper middle class and wealthy Chinese could get a glimpse of the West and of a cosmopolitan world outside. And with the Kaduris too, I mean, there's this great anecdote where a very wealthy Chinese entrepreneur comes to Shanghai from the town where he lives in, and he's setting up his company. And his brother writes to him and says, well, make sure you choose the right feng shui. This is the kind of, you know, belief the Chinese have, that where you locate your business in a building, you know, affects its success. And he writes back and he says, no, 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 I want to make sure it's near the phone line and near the Sassoons and the Kaduris so I can do business with them. And so I think there was a way in which there was the Chinese were learning about global capitalism by working with these families. The other thing is, and even today I think this is true, I don't know if you found it, there's very little anti-Semitism in China. It's one of the few places you can go and say you're Jewish and not have those really uncomfortable conversations that we sometimes have to have in other parts of the world. And I think on an ordinary level, you know, the Chinese, I mean, they think Jews are good at business, but they admire our commitment to family values, our belief in education, something a lot of Chinese families share. And then the other thing that was so striking is that when I talked to the families of the Jewish refugees and read their memoirs, these refugees, we have to remember, they were literally fleeing for their lives when they left Berlin and Vienna. And often their neighbors had turned against them, right? People they thought were their friends turned against them. They describe arriving in Shanghai. They don't speak the language. The Chinese are desperately poor. They're poor. And yet they're struck by how the ordinary Chinese are nice to them. They realize they're suffering. They shared food with them. They would give their kids rides in rickshaws. And so on a human level, I think there was a connection that was built between ordinary Chinese and these ordinary Jews. And I think that persisted to you know, till today. There are political reasons why China and Israel are allied and so forth, but I think there's a fascination with Jews in China, which is genuine.
So our next comment comes from Roberta Cooperman, and then Jerry Federline, I do see you. I want you to know. So I'm going to call on you next. So Roberta?
Yeah, thank you very much for this wonderful presentation. And it did bring me back to my trip to China. And yes, we did go to that hotel, and I could visualize maybe his room, because it is an extremely lavish, still today, hotel, even though Shanghai has definitely taken off as a very modern city. And from there, we actually took a taxi to the Sassoon Museum. And it's very prominent. It's not seems small at all, and very well known, and very much written up in all the tourist books to go and visit. But we also went to Hong Kong, and I never heard about the Kaduris. And as you said, they were much more private than the Sassoons. But I'm wondering, you said you visited, they had a large mansion. Is anything, and we went all over the city and to many different places, and never heard, is there a place to visit there? Or how did you do that research on them?
The Kaduris are still very prominent. They're the richest family, the richest Western family in China. And frankly, I think especially now, with the crackdown in Hong Kong, they're trying to keep a low profile, because I think they're concerned whether the kind of new Beijing attitude towards Hong Kong will affect them as well. They're very successful. They're incredibly successful. They own the electric company. They own these hotels. They have huge investments in China. And I think, like every business, they want to make sure they're staying on the right side of the politics. So their influence is all kind of behind the scenes. They're probably more like Warren Buffett than like the Rockefellers. They have their fingers in everything, but they see the advantage of having a low profile. And that, in fact, it was interesting. I started work on this book about 5 or 6 years ago. And I think by the time it came out, the Kaduris were frankly a little nervous about this attention that they were going to be getting. The book actually is going to be published in China. It's being translated and will be published in China. It was a bestseller in Hong Kong. So that's a sign, I think, that the Chinese government is interested in this history and is willing to accept it. But one reason you don't see a big kind of show-off is that the Kaduris understand that when you're living in a communist totalitarian country, it's sometimes better to keep a low profile than a high one.
I just want to read a quick comment. Amy Lampert writes, I had the luxury of doing a virtual tour of the Jewish quarter in Shanghai through the museum, etc. This is the first I'd ever heard of the story of Jews in Shanghai, and the experience led me to your book, Professor Kaufman. There's also a great PBS special on the topic. And I want to just call now on the Federlines.
Thank you. Nancy has said to me that I should read this book, and after listening to you, I really want to read this book. A few years ago, we were in Hong Kong. We visited the Ohel synagogue there, and we remember seeing the Sassoon name on, as major benefactors of the synagogue. If the Kaduris were listed, we didn't recognize it, so don't recall whether or not they were prominently displayed as the Sassoons. The other point is, the first cousin of my father was one of the 18,000 refugees, and apparently he died in Shanghai, and then a number of years later, his remaining family emigrated to Israel. Is there a ledger or roster somewhere where details can be found?
Yeah.
Of those who died?
Yeah, if you look up on the web, the Shanghai Refugee Museum, I think it's called, or just Google Shanghai Jewish Refugee Museum, they do have records there, and you can do some tracing of kind of what happened to people. Everyone left. Remember, no one had planned to go to Shanghai. It was just the only place they could go. And after the war, people went to Palestine or to Australia. They kind of went wherever they could. I'm
sorry. It's an interesting story regarding this cousin. Apparently, the family thought he was killed by the Nazis in jail in Berlin, but somehow he escaped with his wife and daughter, and they made their way to Shanghai. And like I said, he dies there. Two more kids were born, and the wife in 1951 emigrated to Israel, and that family took root in Safad, only about, as the crow flies, 30 miles away from where my family lives in the Haifa area. And the two families never knew of each other until the connection was made through Yad Vashem some 10 or 15 years ago. We don't have a heck of a lot more detail than that, but it is an interesting story.
Yeah. One thing I was going to say, we talk about the Kaduris, and in some way, I think part of what drew me to these stories is that you wouldn't be surprised to find the Kaduris as members of the synagogue, or being in New York and then joining, some of the synagogues in Manhattan. They are very familiar, I think, and a lot of the dilemmas that they faced, I think, are what drew me to this. That when we do Jewish history, we tend to read about great scholars or great political figures, or we read about the Holocaust. But what's so striking about these families is they were, extremely wealthy, very influential, but they faced these series of moral choices. Do you deal opium or not? What do you do when you see these refugees showing up? Do you flee when the communists take over? Do you recognize the dangers of inequality, or do you kind of turn a blind eye towards them? And that's why I think the book had kind of a resonance for me, in that at some point 50 years from now, people are going to be writing books about us and saying, well, what stand did people take on these very important issues? And in the same way we look back at what the Kadoories and the Sassoons did, it kind of makes you realize that none of us choose our history, but there are these moments where we have to decide what we're going to do. And I think with these two families, you see over and over again, some of their choices we can approve of, some of them we question, but you kind of see the way people are caught up in history and often have to make a choice about which way they're going to go.
To you, Professor Kaufman, thank you so much for joining us today. This was totally fascinating. I want to remind you again, the book is called The Last Kings of Shanghai, the Rival Dynasties That Helped Create Modern China. We hope that you'll buy the book and tell your friends. This presentation has been recorded, and I will send out the link to this presentation on YouTube, and also a link to buy the book so that you can forward this to any friends who you think might be interested. It was certainly an hour extremely well spent. Your students are lucky, Professor Kaufman, to have you teaching them. But again, I want to say, Professor Kaufman, thank you so much for your time. Friends, I look forward to seeing you soon. Thanks so much for coming. I hope you can see, Professor, that you're getting a round of applause.
Thanks very much.
And I hope you enjoy this beautiful spring day, everybody. Thanks so much for coming. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.